This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 257, Kubernetes. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we learn about Kubernetes, what it is, how it's used, and why we should care about it. We're joined by Michael and Toby from Amazingio to explain all of this to us. We have joining us today Michael Schmid, founder, partner, and head of technology, at Amazingio. Prior to working at Amazi, worked at Siemens and was a first lieutenant in the Swiss Air Force. Did you ever spend time in any aircraft?
I did, yes, but mostly at the airport preparing the aircrafts.
Got it. Lived for 1 year in an Airstream and traveled all over the U.S., but is now forced to be stationary due to the corona pandemic, and is currently on the East Coast in Virginia. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
And then joining us as well is Toby Bellwood, product lead at Amazingio. Prior to working at Amazi, Toby was platform tech lead for GovCMS at the Australian Government Department of Finance. Toby lives in Canberra, Australia, where it's actually winter we were talking about before the show.
It is properly winter here. And I can say good morning because it's my morning.
Well, what time is it there right now?
6:30 a.m.
Oh, wow.
It's also the 24th, right?
Yes,
right?
It's tomorrow. Tomorrow is
tomorrow.
morning.
Toby lives in the future. We always can ask him about the lotto and numbers and how the weather is going to be.
This is some sort of weird time warp show. Let's talk to our hosts and see how they're doing. Nick, what's going on with you?
Not too much, plodding along. We've been, I was just thinking this week, we've actually been making a lot of homemade pizza recently. We've discovered these like crusts, like pre-made crusts that you can get from Target, which sounds terrible.
Hold on a second.
But
you just are finding out that there are pre-made pizza crusts out there in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I knew you could get dough. I knew you could get fully pre-made pizzas, but I never knew you could buy pre-made, crusts. So they come in 2 packs, and they're pretty cheap. So we've been making, they barely fit on the pan, but we've been making a lot of homemade pizza over the last couple of weeks, and been really enjoying it. I've been thinking of getting a better platter to cook them on because the cookie sheet we're using.
You need a pizza stone.
I've been thinking about that, but I think that takes longer to cook, right?
No,
I mean,
not
these
really.
things...
You get that thing up to 400. You can cook a pizza pretty quick.
Nick, please tell us you're topping that Target dough with tomatoes and basil from your garden.
That's one of them. I mean, we kind of make 2 different pizzas. One is tomato, basil, cheese, and pepperoni, and the other one is barbecue sauce with chicken and cheese. So just like shredded chicken that we cooked.
Yeah.
You need to toss some red onions on there.
Yeah. That's a good idea. I do have some red onions. So yeah, we've been, and sometimes chicken and mushroom because Jordan really likes that. Wow. But not with the barbecue sauce. That would probably be gross.
Maybe like an
pizza
Alfredo
sauce, chicken and mushroom.
Okay, who's hungry?
Yeah, right. Everybody on the show has stopped listening now and gone to eat.
Toby's looking for breakfast, and we're talking about pizza.
Steven, what's going on with you?
So today's my my prep week to drive to Arizona, leaving in 2 days. So it's been a week of getting things ready, getting cars ready, getting U-Hauls filled up with furniture, getting things done. So
are you going to be back next for? Are you going to be back for next week's show?
I will not. It's in the calendar already. I don't know if you've noticed. It says Steven away.
I'm living week by week at this point. So
yeah.
How many of you guys are driving out? Is just you and Allie? Or?
No, there's 4 of us going. So me, Erica, Allie, and her boyfriend, Zach. So we get 2 vehicles, 1 towing, and we got 2 vehicles and 2 pets. So we got a cat and a hedgehog going with us. So it should be interesting.
Yeah. interesting is not the word I would use, but unless it was Sonic, he can get you there in 10 minutes. But
Right.
We're just going to move right along on that note.
During the next show, my next update should be interesting.
That's
Yep.
needless to say.
What's up with you, John?
So, we're all really relying on the internet these days, being all at home. And Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, both at at 10 o'clock in the morning, my internet just decided to completely go out. And where I live, we literally only have one high-speed internet provider, which is Cox Communications. And, they're okay. But they, you jump on the phone with them and they try to get you to do like text support. Let me enunciate that. And finally you get to it and they're like, oh yeah, there's an outage. It's going to be out for like the next 6 hours. And I'm just like, oh, what? Okay. So, the first day it happened, I was like, all right, it's an outage. It hasn't happened as much, but they were basically blaming it on more people working from home, but it's only started being a problem like last week. So like, how is that really the issue, guys? And then at the end of that conversation, they tried to sell me on their gigabit internet. And I'm like, guys, my hardware is fine. Like this literally I have not had no problems except for this one. And then the next day, the same thing happened. And then the day after that, the same thing happened. So, needless to say, this is kind of a PSA that we need more choices in some neighborhoods for internet. It'd be real nice if I could go, listen, I'm going to switch to Verizon. Also, I'm starting to look for maybe a Wi-Fi hotspot. But just interested if anybody else has had internet issues as late.
I don't think anybody hasn't had internet issues as of late, unless you're on a municipal plan. I mean, Spectrum.
At all.
Steven hasn't, and he's getting like double the speed I am because he has some local internet service provider. Like,
I was going to say that's the
backyard.
That's probably the only exception. Because other than that, like every summer I have issues, and then in the winter it goes away. And Spectrum, same. They like half the time you call and you get a tech that doesn't even realize that you can have a separate Wi-Fi hotspot and router. And
yeah, so I'm gonna jump on my soapbox again for 1 second. What drives me absolutely insane is when you're like, "Hey, can I get a credit for today?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, sure." And the last person I talked to, I'm like, "Can I get a credit for like more than just the $2.50 of service? Because this is like really inconvenient. Like I have a job, I rely on this, and it's a Monday, so like I had a lot of stuff planned today." And they're like, "Oh yeah, we can do that. The crediting system's being finicky. Can you give us a call back and we'll apply that credit?" What kind of backwards customer service is that?
And we don't.
It's not backwards. They do that because most people won't call back and they get to save the money. Like
they won because I haven't called back yet.
Yeah, that's evil ISP Corporation 101.
In the past,
I lost my
Go ahead.
I lost my internet connection in the middle of my DrupalCon panel.
Oh no!
No.
Had to hot swap over to my phone, and just in the middle of that, I got a text message from the ISP saying, "We've noticed an outage on your service." I was like, "Yeah,
You're like, cool.
I noticed too."
not really important or anything. Thanks, guys.
Oh no,
that's too bad.
Michael, what's going on with you? Anything? You're fresh back from DrupalCon?
Yeah, I'm back from DrupalCon last week. Was super exciting because usually DrupalCon for me, I'm getting like in a very interesting state where I'm starting to forget to eat because I meet so many people. And what happened is actually, even though it was all virtual, I forgot to eat lunch because, it was just, it really showed me that DrupalCon is so much more than the location. It's the people and the content. And I think it was super cool to meet all the people, we played like on the booth live streams, we played games like we do at the bars. So it's so interesting for me how something virtual can feel so like something like a physical. So yeah, was very excited. And yeah, this week I spent everything that I couldn't do because I basically was 3 days completely absorbed by DrupalCon to keep up again. So that's what I do right now, or what happened this week.
That was kind of my thing. Like Monday, I was like, I got so much stuff to do because I was at DrupalCon all week, and then the internet went down.
Yeah.
Internet. Toby, what about you? What's going on in Australia?
Our kids went back to school this week. Obviously, Australian schools went back a couple of months ago, but I really noticed a difference when there's just me and the dog in the house. I get through. I listen to audiobooks while I walk the dog. I listen to podcasts, and whenever the kids are home, I just notice them stack up and stack up and stack up, and so I now find myself forced to go out just to try and get through my backlog. And obviously, my Talking Drupal podcast's very near the top of that list. But
Toby,
we appreciate it.
Did your kids do remote learning last fall or in the spring?
Yeah, we had about 4 weeks of remote learning, and my wife is also a primary school teacher, so our house was a hive of internet activity.
Right.
They did really well. I got to the conclusion that if they could do 3 hours of something vaguely educational every day, then that was a success.
Right. That's good.
Seems like a good metric.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I part of obviously being at home all the time is like I have 2 kids, so they're home all the time too, and it's interesting. I'm wondering what it's going to be like when they go back to school and like the house is really quiet. It's going to feel like something's wrong, I think, or something's going to be completely right. I don't know which.
You think it should be A, but it's really B.
And on that note, let's jump into our primary topic. So what is the elevator pitch for Kubernetes? I think, everybody out there is kind of aware of what it is, but they need a good reason to use it. What is that reason?
Yeah, so for me, when I really used it the first time, I actually had a lot of experience in running containers, maybe with Docker Compose locally. And I was always wondering, that's all nice, these containers, but how do you run them like in an actual production environment? Because the inherent feature or problem of containers is that they start and stop so fast that you can lose them at any time. So I was always wondering, like, going to a server and running Docker Compose up, that cannot really be it. And then I saw Kubernetes, and that's really when it clicked for me that Kubernetes is really your orchestrator, or your the piece that takes on the responsibility of all these containers. So it's like the school teacher that teaches all your little kids something, and Kubernetes is really the piece that you just tell Kubernetes, I want this amount of pods or containers running. I need storage connected to that. This pod needs a special IP. This needs a bit network traffic. They are allowed to talk with each other. So Kubernetes is a completely declarative implementation or system where you tell Kubernetes what you want, and Kubernetes makes it for you. And that's really, for me, when I realized what is really cool, that you just tell it what it should do and it does it for you. And you don't have to worry about how exactly that storage is now connected to it. So anybody that ever used containers, I was wondering, okay, how do I run them in production when they die all the time? Kubernetes does that. And it goes, of course, much, much further. But yeah, the really cool thing is that in Kubernetes, if a container dies, the Kubernetes control plane realizes this and automatically starts another one. So that's really, and it's quite a different system, especially if we come from a Drupal world where we define everything, like also how stuff has to happen piece by piece. And this is more a system where you just tell the system what you expect, and it will do it for you.
Yeah, I was gonna actually ask you, I was going to ask if it was reactive in that way, and you just answered that question. Which, I mean, you talk about a container going away and it spinning up another one, but could that also be used as a scaling mechanism if a container is overwhelmed, that it could spin up more containers to help that load?
Yeah, there is fully automated systems that monitor your individual containers or a couple of them. And based on specific metrics, so like if the CPU each of the container reach a specific level, you can just tell it, hey, start another one, and then it also goes down and removes them again if they're not busy anymore. So it's a super highly dynamic system, which is super cool if you understand how it works and have the need for it. But it can also be quite overwhelming sometimes, because there definitely have been cases that like we are on these containers and you're working on it and suddenly they go away and you feel like somebody pulls the rug under the feet of you. So it's definitely the good and the bad at the same time in some cases.
So just out of curiosity, this sounds absolutely amazing. Why isn't every hosting provider using this?
So it's quite the difference in how you think about hosting. Like ourselves, we started to host more than 10 years ago, and these old-fashioned hosting is that you, as the system engineer or the ops team, you create your server and you put the service on that server. It's like a little, it's like a garden. So you have your different beds, and you put that plant in that bed and that plant in that bed, and you really do manage and you hatch them. It's like your little zoo that you control, and that's how we have done for a long time. And the decision, for example, to add an additional server, that was done by a human. What that server has on it was also done by a human. And with Kubernetes, you have to completely get rid of this. You have to think about, there's a saying, cattle not pets. So you want to look at your infrastructure as like a ranch of cattle, where you don't really know the name of each of your cows, compared to a zoo or a pet where you know exactly where each is. And so it really goes away that you tell a system what you expect, and that the system starts to create these containers. And we don't know anymore. When you ask me how many servers do we have running, I will tell you, like, in one infrastructure, we maybe have 100 servers running. I cannot tell you on which server your website is actively running, because at any second, it could be on another one. And that is such a big change on how things were done in the past, not only from a process and from an infrastructure and from a monitoring and point of view, but also from a thinking, like how humans interact with the system is so completely different. And I think that's just what a lot of companies just take quite some time. But actually, if you look at like the big ones, like if you look at like Netflix or things like that have a lot of infrastructure, they use containers since years. They just never told us. Yeah. But this is completely standard for them since years and years and years to have these in systems.
This sounds like the beginning of Skynet. I'm just putting it out there, guys.
Michael, is Kubernetes a open source proprietary product, or where does it come from, and how do you get it?
Kubernetes it's a fully open source project. It was created by Google. They open sourced it 5-6 years ago. Comically enough, you see job posts all the time asking for sort of 10 plus years in Kubernetes. It's probably the original place where people are looking for that sort of super long experience of something before it was even built. No, it's open sourced. It was transferred to the Cloud Native Compute Foundation. So it was put into sort of an open governance structure. And at the moment, it's contributed to by all the major Kubernetes hosting providers. All play a part in building, developing, and bringing Kubernetes forwards. But you wouldn't install it yourself vanilla from scratch.
Unless you were really interested in how it worked, right?
Even then.
So I'm actually curious why you guys chose Kubernetes over other kind of orchestration systems like Rancher OS or Mesosphere. I know at the server level, there's things like Zookeeper. Netflix has a project that can monitor Zookeeper kind of in the same way. I'm curious kind of how you guys selected Kubernetes.
It was a lot of try and error, to be honest. We always did Drupal hosting, and then we had the first customers that came to us and wanted to do Node hosting and Node.js like on the server side. And we knew that our infrastructure that we've built is really good for Drupal, but it's not able to run Node.js. So we looked at new possible solutions. And we tried Docker Swarm was at that point where we were. So that's like 4 or 5 years ago. Was really pushed by the Docker community, by the Docker company. But Kubernetes already at that point started to be used more and more. There already the first like announcement that like AWS might actually have a managed Kubernetes at one point. So we tried different tools. Like we just installed one every day and decided to use them and play with them. And at that point, we actually also looked at OpenShift by Red Hat.
Okay.
Because one of the early things that was really not appealing for us for Kubernetes was that everything was like in one cluster. All the pods, which in the Kubernetes world is a container, runs inside a pod. And all these pods, they were able to talk with everybody else. You didn't have any role-based access controls. If you had one user, you were the cluster admin. And as a hosting company that wants to do like multi-tenancy and high security stuff, this was the big, big no-no. And so we then actually decided to use OpenShift because Red Hat went ahead, used Kubernetes, and basically forked it and added all the security features that we needed to it. In the meantime, in the last 3 years, now all these features actually have been backported by Red Hat, or the Kubernetes community implemented them. So today, from a security point of view, you can reach the same levels, and we are actually now switching also to Kubernetes, to native Kubernetes, because it just has a much wider usage. But that was really the decision. We tried Mesosphere, we tried Docker Swarm, and nothing really felt like really something that we really liked. In Kubernetes, after you had a couple of light bulb moments, it made really sense.
One of if you've seen Amazingio talking at a Drupal conference, one of the things we really push quite hard is the fact that we're an open source container hosting company. And so we're really looking at open source front to back, top to bottom. And it's not just, there's two levels of open source. There's the open source that my project's available, the source code's on the internet and you can download it and see it for yourself. Or there's the strength of the community behind it. There's a massive community behind Drupal. There's a massive community behind Kubernetes. And that's something that it really gives us strength that we're probably not the only people facing some sort of issue. And we're not contributing back. I don't know if Michael's contributed anything to Kubernetes, but apparently it's massively complex to contribute to, but there's a lot of people that are, and because they're doing such different things, such different industries, there's a real strength in the community around that product.
You mentioned something that actually I'm curious about. So you said you're kind of open source top to bottom. Does that include hardware? Have you managed to find open source hardware that works in in your type of business?
That's a good question. We try to stay away from hardware, just that we think as a small team that we don't actually physically host ourselves in data centers. So we always use some kind of infrastructure as a service, but we actually can run our whole infrastructure on Raspberry Pis. So if you really, really want to go and compile against ARM, which now is going to be used anyway more and more, it is possible to run the whole stack down to the hardware on open source.
Very cool.
So clearly, I'm wearing this fancy Drupal T-shirt. I'm clearly a Drupal guy. How is Kubernetes used in the Drupal world?
So there are a couple of hosting companies like us that use Kubernetes as the underlying stack, or the platform or the system that they use. Unfortunately, most of our competitors are not as open source as we are, that we could just look into their source code and see what they're using. We know that some companies use some kind of container system. So maybe we shortly have to explain that containers itself are actually not something new. They exist since the Linux kernel since quite some time. Docker just made them really easy usable. With one command line, you run one command and it handles all the C groups and the kernel permissions and all that stuff for you. And Kubernetes uses Docker to do all the orchestration on top of this. But like I said, the containers are not something new. So some of hosting companies, specifically in the Drupal world, actually implemented their own container orchestration system. Because they started before Docker or Kubernetes even existed. And so containers are quite widely used. Kubernetes itself, we see more and more companies starting to offer services on top of Kubernetes. So if you walk around at DrupalCon and ask a couple of companies, they say that they use Kubernetes underlining. What we also see is more and more bigger companies now having whole containerization strategies. And they end up using Kubernetes, driven by not specifically the Drupal team, but driven by like the internal IT of a big enterprise company. And then the teams have to figure out how to run on these infrastructures. And so sometimes we have like, there's a Kubernetes channel in Slack, in the Drupal Slack. And yeah, from time to time, you have people that come up saying, oh yeah, I'm using Kubernetes, and internally I figured out how to run it. So I think it starts to be more and more. 2-3 years ago at DrupalCon, we had a panel about Kubernetes, and yeah, you asked who used Kubernetes, and just like maybe 1 or 2 people. If you ask this now, you find easily 50, 60 people of a group of 100 that already have used Kubernetes in some kind or another form. I think a lot of times people are using it more for dev environments still, because this whole your container can die at any second. You don't know anymore where it is. This is very scary for some people. So that pushes some people away, saying, I want to first try it all out. I want to make sure that it all works, and then I switch.
So I think one of the big questions, I'm very familiar with containers. I use them all the time, especially locally. It's not just the container going away. It's knowing that the traffic has somewhere to go. And so if you have multiple web heads, you need something that points to them and load balances between them. If you have multiple database containers, you need to make sure that you have a trusted source container. Does Kubernetes kind of handle that piece of it? Do you just say, we need this database, we need 2 copies of the database, this is the primary, it's going to replicate here, and it just kind of takes care of it?
So Kubernetes handles everything up to the traffic to the individual containers. So you can say, I have these 5 containers. They are all part of a so-called Kubernetes service. And if you make a TCP connection to this service, the service forwards it to one of the 5 containers. But what happens inside the containers? So like, let's say you have a MySQL replication system that you need to build yourself again. Kubernetes has no understanding of what's running inside these containers, but it knows how to connect these. So you can imagine like Kubernetes is really the piece that if you would have physically servers, you have somebody that tells, okay, connect this server to this server, connect this server to this server. But what is running in these servers is your job again.
So go ahead.
Just curious from from the Drupal standpoint, right? So we have imagine we have like 2 web heads and 2 database servers kind of in our environment, and Kubernetes is kind of like these things are going away and popping up whenever. Is Kubernetes providing like environment variables for you to drop into like your settings.php file to make sure that the connection to the database, even if it goes away and comes back, is preserved?
Yes. Yeah, Kubernetes brings a lot of configuration management with it. So what you can, for example, do, there are things like there are environment variables. They have a thing called config maps, which is basically just a list of configurations, which can be files or individual environments. You have secrets, which you should probably better use for your passwords because you can encrypt the secrets. And Kubernetes, yes, you can tell, okay, these pods should know about all these config maps and about these secrets. So when Kubernetes starts a pod, it automatically injects the files or the environment variables for you into these containers. So you have one central place that you manage them, and you really don't want to go to a container and do anything manually anymore. Like you have to completely stop thinking about the possibility to go inside a container and do anything manual, because you don't want to do this at 3 a.m. in the morning if the container dies. So it has to be all fully automated. And yes, like Drupal needs to, or you need a system that automatically sees the database cluster and connects to it, for example.
Okay. There's some services that work better in Kubernetes than others. Something, a Varnish service is quite typical in Drupal world. Varnish, if you've got multiple Varnish pods, you've got to find a way of telling your Drupal site that it's got multiple Varnish pods. Otherwise, the default behavior is to clear whichever Varnish pod. Drupal, if it's clearing a cache, it will only clear the cache of the pod it's connected to at that particular moment. And if you've got other replicas. So quite often, if you're looking at building these systems at scale, you need to provide services between services. So Drupal will tell the Varnish service that it is clearing, and the Varnish service will say, hey, I've got 6 pods. I'm going to wipe my 6 pods. So same for databases. So yeah, it's a bit of a quantum shift.
So do you use something like Consul in coordination with Kubernetes for service discovery? I know Consul is like the vagrant.
Yeah, you can use Consul. We don't use it directly. What a lot of times you do is either via Kubernetes itself, you can, by the DNS system, you have service discovery already. So you can ask Kubernetes how many pods are behind the service, and via DNS it will tell you. So that's one way of service discovery. The other thing is, what a lot of times also happen is that you build a small proxy service or a small proxy pod in between that, for example, would receive the request, because Drupal has no idea about multiple Varnish services or servers. So you build a little proxy that then forwards this. So that's also another way. If the tool doesn't support it, you can add sidecars, what they're called in Kubernetes, that you put like a second container beside your real container to it. So there is a lot of different ways how to do it, and that's really deciding which of them makes most sense. That's actually a hard part. The technical solution a lot of times are there. You can find all these proxies, you can find them online, they're open source. Deciding which one of them is sometimes a bit a harder part than actually coding it.
One of the things we covered earlier was the sort of the scaling, and how does you have multiple web heads. When we're looking to architect a Drupal site, and this is something that is fairly commonplace now, is trying to work out what elements of the site are going to scale. If you start to take a lot more hits because you've got traffic up, you're going to need more web. If you're trying to take more complex hits, if you're starting to do a lot more searches, a lot more autocomplete, if you've got all sorts of other things running, you're going to need more back-end power. And it's trying to work out how you can scale those things either together or independently. We bundle we use on our tech stack, we use Nginx for serving files, and we use PHP for serving Drupal. We bundle the PHP and the Nginx pods into one container, and then we make that container scalable. So as it starts to hit the CPU limits, either for PHP or for Nginx, it's rarely going to hit an Nginx container limit, but more often as it hits a PHP limit, it will create a whole new copy of the PHP and the Nginx, and it will keep creating both as it goes through. So you're not going to have that bottleneck where you've got a lot of back-end growth, but your front end hasn't grown. So it's trying to sort of turn it a little bit on its head.
Very interesting. So I guess, I think one final thing that related to kind of the more Drupal side of things, one of the things that's really become big in the Drupal world is, continuous integration. You run a bunch of tasks right before you deploy, you run some tasks right after you deploy, you build your theme, you import configuration. And obviously the connections are there, but when you're doing a deploy and you have like a bunch of different pods, how do you make sure that, for example, Drush is targeting one of those? Do you end up having a separate pod that is like your services container that connects, or is it something else?
Yep. Yeah. One of the big important things with Kubernetes is Kubernetes works really well if you have one container, one service. So that's why what Toby mentioned before, we technically could put PHP and Nginx into one container. There are capabilities of this, but we decided we want to have Nginx in one and one in PHP. So you want to make sure that one container has exactly one main process running. because Kubernetes decides if this process dies, it will restart the container or the connected pod to it. And so you really want to make sure that each service is in one individual one. And so how we built them, or how Lagoon builds them, is that, yes, if you, let's say, have a really big site, you're going to have maybe 10 Nginx PHP pods with each an Nginx and PHP container in it. But these PHP containers, they actually don't have Composer installed. They don't have Drush installed. They don't have Drupal console installed. They just have PHP plain. But then you have a secondary, or a pod that we call the CLI pods that have all your toolings around installed. So there you install Drush and Composer and console. So that if you run, if you connect to the site and want to run like a Drush command, you actually connect to one dedicated container that does only that. And not only that, it's actually the container is started only when you need it. So when you connect to it, Kubernetes sees, oh, somebody wants to access the CLI, then it starts the container for you. You run your commands, and after you're done, the container is shut down again.
Very cool.
So it's a completely different thinking.
You mentioned Lagoon a few minutes ago. Could you tell us what Lagoon is and how you use it?
Yes. So very early on, we realized everything we just talked about, that's completely new knowledge, especially if you come from a Drupal world. Like, who knows about these services and persistent storage, and I don't know what all these things. And so
you're describing
the initial first. Yeah. So the initial first thing would be, oh, we just teach everybody Kubernetes, and it's just another thing to learn. But I have to say, it's quite complex. So we decided we want to create a system that sits in between the developers and Kubernetes, where a developer, they just push their Git code into a Git repository. And then a system should take this Git repository, analyze it, and say, oh, this is a Drupal. You need storage. You need a load balancer. You need X, Y, and Z. And then talks to Kubernetes and tells Kubernetes, hey, here is a site that please create all these different things. And so basically, we need a translator from the Git repository to Kubernetes. And that's what Lagoon does. So Lagoon realizes when you push a Git repository, it analyzes your files. So you have a couple of YAML files that you can tell Lagoon that you need a PHP container, an Nginx container, that this is Drupal, you need 2 databases, you need a Redis.
Is this like a Lando for production?
Yeah. I mean, in the extent you could call it that, yes. Right. The difference is that Kubernetes or Lagoon really talks Kubernetes, while Lando talks Docker locally. Right, yeah. But it's similar, yes. Yeah. And so Lagoon will take over. It will talk all the Kubernetes for you. You don't have to learn Kubernetes in any way in order to deploy your code against Kubernetes. Lagoon knows the quirks of Kubernetes, like the order of things. Like, especially in Drupal, we are a bit special that we need to run commands after all the containers are executed. Like the fact that we need to run Drush after you updated the code in the world of web hosting, that's quite special, actually. And so Lagoon knows about this. Lagoon knows that if you need a Drush command, it needs to first update all the containers. It waits until all the containers are up to date, and then it runs the Drush command. And it also has a UI, so you can see what's going on. You have like Slack integration, so you can get a Slack ping if it worked or not. And so basically, Lagoon is the system that helps you deploy your code into Kubernetes.
So Lagoon's basically replacing DevOps guys across the globe. Like, hey, DevOps guy, I need a database server. Oh, well, no, never mind. I'm just going to type that into Lagoon. It's going to do it for me.
Yes, the idea. I mean, I'm not saying we need to get rid of the DevOps people, but
no, we love our DevOps people.
The idea of Lagoon is we follow GitOps or infrastructure as code as much as possible. Right. So you define in a super simple format that you need a database, that you need a Redis, that you want an Elasticsearch. You just add this into like 2-3 lines of YAML. You push this at Lagoon, and Lagoon then knows, oh, this is a production environment. Okay, so I will go to the production database cluster, create an automatic user for you, inject the environment, the user and the password as environment variables back into the running containers. So all of that is handled, and you just tell it what I want. Like Kubernetes itself, it's declarative. So you tell what you want, you say do it, and it will going to do it for you.
That was actually my next question. So it can handle like a development environment, a feature branch environment, kind of out of the box. And so you would just point your DNS at your Kubernetes endpoint essentially, and it handles.
Yeah,
oh, that's super cool.
You tell it which routes, like which URLs you want your sites react to. Lagoon will automatically get Let's Encrypt certificates for this.
Nice.
Yeah, all you have to do is Lagoon really needs to know your Git project, and it needs a DNS change, and that's pretty much it. And the cool thing is, because all of these containers, they are fully dynamic, Lagoon can create new environments on the fly for you. So we have like integrations into pull requests. So if you create a new pull request, let's say your GitHub or your GitLab or the Bitbucket tells Lagoon, hey, there's a new pull request. So Lagoon will create a completely new environment for that pull request with the code of that pull request on the fly with a database and everything. So then you can test that specific pull request. And when you're good, you say, okay, merge it in. Then the GitHub tells Lagoon, hey, it was merged, and then Lagoon throws everything away, and the resources are free to use.
I have a super nitpicky question that will blow my mind if you do this. Does it support both merge-based flows and rebase flows?
Can you explain what for you the difference is? Because I think we do, but I want to make sure.
So, like, for example, in GitHub, you can do a merge-based flow, which will just merge in the pull request, and you'll have the merge commit. Or you can do a rebase flow that will rebase the pull request onto master, so that you just have the change commits.
So what Lagoon does for you, if you open a pull request and it say you want to merge your feature branch into the master branch, what Lagoon will do, it will check out the master branch first and then merge the feature branch on top of that master branch.
So it's merge based. Yep.
Yes. So Lagoon does the code that exists in the pull request environment is the code as it would be that you already would have clicked the pull request merge.
Okay, so it doesn't do the rebase workflow then.
No, but
I have some clients that do only rebase; they never merge.
Well, the environment though of the PR is gonna go away eventually.
Yeah.
So, but you could use rebase. I mean, send us a pull request. I'm happy to get that in.
I'll take a look because I have a couple clients that are very particular. They don't ever want merge commits in the master branch. So instead of doing merge requests, they do rebase requests.
Yeah. But important is Lagoon does never change your Git code. So the merge actually still happens by you or in the Git UI or the Git server. Lagoon just checks it out and runs it for you. And Lagoon actually, by default, we don't even ask the customers for write access to the Git repositories. We just need read access because Lagoon will never want to change your code. It should never change your code.
So if someone's hosting a site with you, is it Lagoon that's going to be used for all those sites?
Correct.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. And
one of the other things that Lagoon does is bring all the other services you need to host a Drupal site in. So, I mean, we've talked obviously about Nginx, PHP, MySQL, etc. Lagoon will also fold in the logging connectors. It'll fold in backups and the backup connectors. Mm-hmm. We've got some pretty advanced security stuff, so we can do full vulnerability and security scanning on these images we create. And Lagoon knows about this stuff, and it knows about this contextually per project. So when you configure a project in Lagoon, it knows where the logs go, it knows where the backups go, it knows what the backup schedule is, it knows whether those security stuff is being done. The actual developer themselves doesn't need to know any of that stuff. Basically, they launch their product, they click their Git commit. Lagoon takes that project and says, okay, for this one, we're doing full application router logs, we're doing backups are happening twice a day. Lagoon will add all that stuff into the Kubernetes configuration for those projects. So that's handled for you. That's, I mean, converting a Docker Compose file to a Kubernetes file and hosting it up in a Kubernetes is, I'm going to say, relatively simple, relatively doing a lot of work in that sentence, but a relatively simple exercise. Trying to run these kind of sites with the things that you need to be able to run a site. That's where the complexity comes in, and that's the other part of what Lagoon does. As well as launching the sites, it adds all the extra stuff in, and we're continually looking at the extra stuff that we're adding in to each of those sites so that people get the full experience. They can see router logs, they can output Watchdog to somewhere that it can be browsed and searched, and then there's monitoring.
So I imagine everybody listening to this show right now is like super excited about this because it sounds really, really, really cool, right? And as we all know, Drupal runs a large number of websites, from like one-page personal websites to like Fortune 500 and government websites, right? What's the best use case for Kubernetes? And let me say that a different way. Like, when should somebody say like, yes, I need to use Kubernetes, and when should they be like, it's probably not going to be as beneficial for me?
I think it really depends on if you run, or let's say, does the person we're talking about, do they run their own servers right now?
Okay, so that's a deciding factor, right? Are you running your own servers versus if you're working with a host, right?
Correct.
So if you're with a host, you're probably going to do whatever they require. If you're you're hosting with Amazingio, obviously you're already there, so we don't need to worry about you. Say the person's running their own servers.
Yeah. So let's say you are a person that runs your own servers, that has figured out maybe with Ansible how you deploy your Drupal site, stuff like that. Would I suggest to switch to Kubernetes right now? I don't think so. We are probably a bit too early. It's still a lot of changing in Kubernetes, but also in Lagoon, or like how we run applications. We, for example, since we do Kubernetes hosting, we probably changed 4 times how we provision databases, just because there's always new ways that Kubernetes, the community, comes up. So if you have your own server somewhere that wants to be running, I think keep with that. If you though think about, okay, like I want to add additional support, for example, beside of Drupal, I want to add a support for something else, let's say Node.js, or you want to implement a Elasticsearch, or you need a system that automatically provisions you branches or pull requests based on usage, or you realize that your servers are not automatically scaling. So if you plan to change something on your infrastructure, I think then it's maybe the time to really think about it. Because all of these things, supporting other systems, automatic scaling, having better high availability, all of this is going to be so much easier with Kubernetes. Like for us, supporting a new CMS, even if it's not Drupal, even if not PHP, takes for us maybe half a day of work, because all the deployment systems, all the servers, everything is exactly the same, no matter if you now run a Python, a Perl, a Go, or a PHP, because it's just containers. While in the old world, where we specifically planted these services, like if you try to run a second PHP version on a server that already has PHP installed, you're going to go into hell. Like that's going to be really, really hard. So I think that's where it really makes sense. If you are in a point that you say, I want to go to the next level, then it is. One of the really important things that is now happening are all these managed Kubernetes services. So in the past, Kubernetes basically exists of 2 pieces. One of them is the Kubernetes control plane. That's the actual orchestrator. That's the piece that receives the requests via the API and does the actual thing. And you have the compute nodes. That's where all the pods are running. In the past, you had to worry about both of them. So you had to run a control plane, which is like Drupal core. You had to update it. You had to monitor it. You had to secure it. You had to do all these things. And you had to run the compute nodes. Now, with managed Kubernetes, the control plane is taken for you. So like at AWS, the tool called EKS, or at Azure, they have a tool called AKS. It's not confusing at all. They do the control plane for you. So you just say, hey, I want the Kubernetes control plane. You wait 2 minutes, and you have an API, and you can talk Kubernetes to it. And you don't worry about upgrading, about securing this. And the same is also more and more, you can also say, and I want 5 servers, and these with 6 CPUs and 20 gigabytes of RAM and all that stuff. And they also start them for you. You don't even have to worry about that. So right now, it starts to get easier and easier and easier to even run a Kubernetes cluster. Doesn't mean, though, that There's no logging yet. There's no monitoring yet. There's all these other things that Toby talked about. They're not there yet. So you still have to worry about them. But what we're working on with Lagoon right now is to handle that specific case where somebody says, I have a couple of servers, I have a Kubernetes on it. Can I please use Lagoon to deploy against these servers? So that's something that we're working on really hard with the community, with developers out there, to make Lagoon available for more people that already have a Kubernetes cluster, like a managed Kubernetes cluster somewhere running.
And is Lagoon just to be used with Drupal sites, or could it be any infrastructure or any site?
No, we've been doing a lot of work recently with our clients and customers on one of the big things about Lagoon is you don't just run Drupal. So if you've got 6 Drupal sites and a WordPress site that you're going to bring to Drupal, and you've got a Python thing that you've built, and you've got some Gatsby or Hugo static sites out there, we can host them all in Lagoon. Obviously in preparation for migrating them all to Drupal eventually. But one of the things that we've been really working on is making all these other sort of demonstrations and examples. I've spent a lot of time this week doing WordPress examples and making Silverstripe examples. And
Silverstripe, oof.
I was going to say,
I supported Silverstripe's site.
I was going to say, I know all of the things you talked about, but what is WordPress? I'm not familiar with that one. Anyway,
it's like Drupal for people that aren't cool. That's my invite to any WordPress
maybe
event.
Right, you heard it here first, folks.
Like they've all got the same kind of architectural considerations. How do we set up those kind of sites to use the same Kubernetes paradigm that we've done for Drupal?
So I'm curious to hear a little bit about the relationship between Amazing.io and Amazi.com. Can you give me a little bit of insight into that?
Yeah. So Amazi, as its own thing, is basically a group of companies that do web services. We actually started with Amazi Labs, so more than 10 years ago. Yeah, it's pretty much 10 years ago now. I was part of Amazi Labs, and we built websites. So we built websites for customers that came to us. We were the typical Drupal shop, the Drupal agency. And coming from Switzerland, we actually needed hosting in Switzerland, and none of the hosting companies, our competitors, could offer this. So I was almost forced to do it ourselves. And so we built these tools, and then, like I mentioned, we had the first customers that wanted to use, or our internal team, which was like my customer at the point as the IT team of Amazi. We needed to host Node.js, and we wanted to do other things, different PHP versions. And so we built this tool that was based on Kubernetes. But at that point, it was always based on our own needs. And then as Drupal grew in interest, more and more people asked us, like, how do you deploy and how do you use these tools? And we were like, yeah, we've built our own into tool. No, it's not for you. And we don't, it's only within Amazi. But the more people asked, we realized, we actually are maybe onto something here. So we decided to split out Amazing.io as the hosting part out of Amazi Labs. And so today, these are 2 separate independent companies. Some customers are using both. Some customers are only using one of them. And the Amazi Group, or Amazi.com, which is the website of the Amazi Group, is just a holding company above this. So this provides like the legal framework and some other frameworks. But at the end, all the different Amazi companies, they're individual companies with their own business models and their own goals. Things.
So who are the Amazing.io competitors? I mean, coming to mind, obviously, would be Acquia and Pantheon. Who are the others, and what distinguishes you from them?
Yeah. So if you look into the Drupal sphere specifically, if you talk about Drupal hosters, you definitely have Acquia, Pantheon, and Platform. Right. From a technical point of view, we're probably the closest to Platform, just in the fact that we can host more than just Drupal or WordPress. Like specifically about Node.js on server side is no problem. It's not going to be a difference. You can even run them in the same Git repository. But of all of these 4, so if you would add us to these 3, we're the only ones that is completely based on Kubernetes, and we're also the only one that is completely open source. So everything that we do, all the scripts, all the platforms, all the deployment, all the configs is all on our GitHub and completely open source. If you go a bit further, you have other smaller hosting companies that also do Drupal hosting. They're maybe focused on only a specific region, or let's say only one specific country. And there are some of them out there. Some of them use Kubernetes. Some of them are open source. We have a couple of we see some hosting companies that use Aegir as their underlying system.
Right.
And then, of course, if you go further outside of the Drupal sphere, you end up with competitors from Heroku to AWS Lightsail to your bare metal, HOV, Hetzner. Like, it's a big field and a big, big wide world out there.
So who would you say your ideal customer is then? Who are you looking for?
I think people that have got it's always like we love every customer, all of our customers equally. I've got to do some backpedaling after my dig at WordPress. We love all our customers equally, but the kind of the best model is customers that have lots of sites that have a real Git workflow. Should be looking towards us. People are looking to host multiple platforms. An obvious target. One of the things that I think we've really seen is, and Michael and I did a bit of a panel at DrupalCon about scaling on a dime, basically. I used to work at GovCMS, the Australian government's whole of government Drupal platform, and we did Amazingio. Lagoon is the platform that supports GovCMS. And so there was a really good bit of press in the last few weeks around GovCMS and some of the growth that sites had experienced, particularly because of coronavirus. They host a lot of government health and information services. And the numbers are staggering. We're looking at sort of 600, 700% increases in traffic, not just spiking, but spiking and sustaining, and the demonstrated ability of Kubernetes particularly, but our platform to be able to handle that kind of scale events. Just before the show started, we were talking about load testing, and the platform was handling more traffic than we'd load tested for, which is relatively unheard of. I'll point out that we were load testing sort of 18 months, 2 years ago, but yeah, seeing that kind of stuff, and we weren't having to come back to people and saying, oh, we've noticed an uptick of traffic on your server. We're going to have to upsize your webs. We're going to have to schedule some downtime for you in 48 hours so we can migrate you to a new whatever. This stuff comes as part of the package. So for that kind of traffic, for that kind of experience, they're the kind of customers that really, really benefit from this platform and this technology.
I've got two questions there. One is, what was your anxiety level during that period of time of this spike in traffic? That's one question.
If you would look,
and then the second question is, how do you position your business and pricing around that kind of scenario for like coronavirus, where someone goes 600% increase sustainable traffic? Were people paying by usage, and how do you work out that kind of situation?
Yeah, if you would look into our Slack channel, fun fact, we actually got like 15 minutes notice in some cases of this high event. So we get like a ticket that says, hey, in 15 minutes, we're going to send a test message to every Australian citizen. And yeah, if you would scroll back into our Slack channels, you saw a lot of anxiety happening. Of like mostly GIFs, and I think World War C was a lot used, like the zombies taking over your house. That was definitely, it's that short of a notice that you can still scale up the pods, and we did in some cases. In some cases, we just left it because we wanted to see. But in like any future system, like if you would have to tell me 4 years ago that this will happen, I would have told you that's impossible. Like we cannot do this, because physically it was like just logging into the or like opening up and a script that starts more servers and boots up an additional server at AWS and configures it takes already 30 minutes. Like I would have probably disconnected my computer and ran away if you were like to not come online. And now it was like, okay, we're ready. Like you're standing there with the shield. Come on, we can do this.
So you were excited.
You were excited, yes.
I think one of the I think one of the more impressive things too that you mentioned earlier is that these weren't just purely static pages that you were serving 100,000 views per minute. They had search on them. People were actively updating the pages while this many people were visiting it, and the load time I think you said was less than 3 or 4 seconds still the whole time. I mean, that's mind blowing. I mean, anybody can easily serve a static site 100,000 times, but to serve a Drupal site with search and people editing it, I mean, that's seriously impressive.
So, yeah, I mean, that's what's the thing that we also said, we cannot, we could have told the editors, no, you're not allowed to edit anymore, but we also have to stand this, it's the government that needs to tell people what is going on. And you want to make sure that they can talk when new breaking things happening or the new data is out. And people, of course, they started to realize that the data, let's say, is always published at a specific time of the day. So people started to sit there and press F5 before the new data came out for the day, and then you have.
I'm one of them.
No, we really said it. Of course, we could have done, and there were contingency plans that if we realize that it goes really, really bad, there are systems that we would have in place to fall back into these static generated sites and stuff. But we really believed, we trusted the system, we trusted in it, and we came out with 100% uptime, which was really great.
Wow.
Second question, so sorry.
Yeah, and that second question was the business side of, you mentioned earlier, you guys don't own the hardware. You basically get the service from someone else. So during that spike, your costs clearly went up. So how did you work that out with your customers?
So we have two major pricing models. One of them being that you just pay per usage, and pay per usage is usage of the hit.
Gotcha.
So every single hit is counted. And because we don't like how some of our competitors ask you, how much CPU and RAM do you use? Yeah. And honestly, I'm the CTO of a hosting company. Yeah. I cannot tell you how much CPU and RAM my website is going to use because I don't know. And so this was always something that I really didn't like as a developer myself, that they ask me for things that I have no idea. And so we tried to find a metric that you could figure out if you have the site already running. So that's why we use hits. So every single hit, I mean, the price for one hit is like at 1/100th of a cent, it's super small. Mm-hmm. But basically with that, we fold all the CPU, all the RAM, all of the costs are folded in there. Because if you have more hits, we have to bring more servers we have to pay like AWS or Azure more server costs. And so this is what keeps the balance of it. And that's one of the ways. The other way is what we call a dedicated infrastructure, where we set up for you your own Kubernetes cluster. And that's, for example, what the case is in the Australian government. So they have their own Kubernetes cluster, and they actually paid their AWS bill. They decided to host on AWS, but we could also host in Azure or in Google Cloud. They pay the bill themselves. So they pay us a fixed fee to manage the cluster. But actually, during these spike times, they did not have to pay Amazi more money, right? Because the cluster did not have to change in size, because the cluster is built for that spike event. What was higher cost is, of course, was an AWS bill because they had additional traffic and stuff. And that's really the two different ways how we offer our customers. And it really depends a bit on size, how much traffic do you need, but usually that's something we figure out when they come to us. Do we do this dedicated, or do we do more the pay per usage?
Super interesting, because a lot of hosting companies are moving in that direction. It seems to be like, hey, we're going to measure your hits or your page views, and that's what we're going to base your hosting bill on, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because we had a lot of customers that they have one spike event per year. Let's say you are an NGO, and you have like Christmas time or holiday time is their huge event. And I saw infrastructures that had 7-8 web apps running for 1 day per year, and that did not make sense to me.
Right.
So we said, how can we do this? And so they pay now every month. They pay like maybe a 20 times less than what they usually pay, and then in 1 month they pay more, but they're okay because during that time, and that's what the pricing model, they pay per usage. So it always goes like into a serverless system where you just pay whatever the servers actually are going to be used.
And also having to nominate how many gigabytes or how many CPU or whatever. Now that more and more of us are using Composer, particularly Composer, if you've got a platform where you don't need a lot of memory to run your actual site, but if you want to run a Composer update on a Drupal site on the hosting platform, you're going to need 2 gig of RAM just to be able to get Composer through. So like you could make do with like half a gig for normal running, but that really sort of spiky. If you do a particularly large migrate or an import, you're going to see sort of momentary spikes. And the last thing we want as a developer experience is for people to have to upsize their server for that one use case.
Hey, if you have questions about this show or any other show, you could reach out to us at Twitter at Talking Drupal. We also have a Slack channel at the Drupal Slack. It's #Talking Drupal. And you can always email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. We also have a newsletter that comes out every once in a while, and you can subscribe to that at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
We'd also like to take a moment to thank our patrons for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose to become a patron. And the main benefit is you get a private raw feed of the show with a little bit before and after show.
So, Michael, Toby, it's been awesome having you guys on the show, and I feel like I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners did. Is there anything before we close out here that we missed or that you guys would like to say?
I think from my side, we really try to create an open source community or a system. So look at Lagoon, like as Drupal. We believe we succeeded when we have multiple companies, maintainers, contributors. So if you're interested in helping out in learning Kubernetes, Lagoon is the perfect solution to learn Kubernetes. And because you don't have to know anything, but you can look into it, what it actually did. So we have issues on our GitHub that are for beginners, that are super easy. We can have documentation people. So if you're somehow interested in helping, please don't please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We have also Slack channels on the Drupal Slack. We have GitHub. Toby is happy to show you how to contribute. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to be more than just the other Drupal hosting company. We're trying to be an open source project.
And it sounds really like open. I can get that Lagoon running on my Raspberry Pi cluster, right?
Yeah.
Give us a few weeks.
For those of you listening to the audio, there was a wince there before saying yes. Just letting you know. Okay. All right. So, Michael, if somebody wanted to get a hold of you and ask you more questions, how would they be able to do that?
Send me an email under michael@amazi.com. Find me on Twitter under the name Schnitzel, or pretty much anywhere in the world of the internets. Or I've heard there's an owl service as well. So if you can send me an owl, I'm happy to receive an owl.
Fabulous. Toby, how about you?
I'm Toby Bellwood on Twitter, LinkedIn, all those places. I think I'm the only person with my name in the world, so I'm relatively easy to find. It's been rumored that if you say Lagoon 3 times, I magically appear. But yeah, Slack, we've got a Rocket chat. Just see where you can find us, reach out, and one of the team is always happy to try and help people navigate through these choppy waters.
Cool. Nick, where can people find you?
People can always find me online at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
Steven, what about you?
I'm Steven Cross on Twitter with a PH.
And as always, I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. You can find out about Oomph at oomphinc.com. And as always, if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.